Hello and welcome to this week's podcast of The Sunrise Road. This is a production of Eastridge Presbyterian Church, and I'm very thankful for our producer, Vince Rule, who makes everything look easy. We are a podcast where we have conversations that connect and weave hope into the fabric of our shared lives. And my name is Melody Jones Pointon, and I am super excited this week to welcome a couple of guests, one of whom I know really well, because he lives in my house and we share children together. And his best friend, our good friend from Northern Ireland. So I'm excited to welcome Steve Pointon, who is, in addition to being my husband, is just an all-around fantastic person. He grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland during the Troubles, as did his best friend Joe. Grew up in Northern Ireland, in Belfast during the Troubles. And what we want to do today is just share a little bit about their story and how they grew up and how they became friends. So welcome, Steve and Joe. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you, Melody. It's great to see you. I'm Steve. I don't know what you're thinking now. You see Melody every day, but it's really lovely to be here. Melody, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's like 8 o'clock at night in Northern Ireland, so it looks like it's
Yeah, it's quite dark. The stars are sparkling tonight. It's beautiful winter evening. Or spring, I think it is now.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be. So, thank you both so much for joining us. So we've been talking about this book by Elizabeth Oldfield, who happens to be British. She's an author from the UK, and she's taking us on a Lenten journey through discovering more about the people that we want to be. She says she wants a luminous soul, which just totally makes my heart sing because I agree. Would be great to have a luminous soul. But she sort of says we kind of need to do some work to get there. It's kind of like yoga or Pilates. We kind of need to do some spiritual practices. So the spiritual practice this week is taking a look at wrath and moving from polarization to peacemaking. And I thought probably one of the stories that has really meant a lot to me, as you all have shared it, is the story of how you each grew up in Belfast and how you became friends. So how'd that happen?
Do you want to go first, Joe, or do you want me to go first?
You go first. You're the man.
Yeah. I was born and raised in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, during the early 1980s, at a time when Northern Ireland was very much engaged in an armed conflict, an armed struggle, in particular, a conflict that involved both sides of the community, the Protestant and the Catholic communities. I was born and raised on the Protestant side of the community, and as I grew up, I realized that all of my identity, all of who I am, all of my cultures, all of my traditions were all shaped and formed and told by that community. That was who I was, and that was what shaped who I was and who I would become as well. As I got involved in particular in my church and in some local peacemaking projects within my church, that was where any initial kind of vision beyond my own communities and the fact that there were other communities really started to be established with that seed and with that idea as well.
Yeah. And I suppose I grew up on the other side of the fence. I love the concept of polarization to peace because me and Steve definitely live polarized lives. Like I grew up where identity was shaped by Irishness, like I see your Catholic faith, and also a historical concept of being an oppressed people or like a historical conflict with the English, a narrative that kind of fitted into your story as a people. And I suppose in particular that separation from, my Protestant brothers and sisters. Um, and I know maybe we're talking about Catholic and Protestant, but there was probably more of the other was probably more, I think, the English, the conflict, as Steve said, it was complex, it was political, it was religious, it was rich and poor, it was silly, and even today to sit here and think back to when I was growing up, it was a militarized zone where, army were stopping you, checking you, searching you, and we couldn't leave our communities. And there's, it's like you think of Israel, Palestine, there's like 40-foot walls dividing communities. That was our reality. And, it shaped us and actually kept us apart. And in many ways, I know in America, people are blessed with the diversity around them. And I know other issues exist, but we never encountered the other until, post the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and even the challenges associated with, moving towards peace. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. There's still times where you feel you become aware of the polarization, and we are still working on peace. Isn't something that kind of just happens. It's constantly, worked upon, and but that concept of, the other was really massive to us. And I know me and Stevie probably definitely had different lives, different experiences, and they shaped us.
I remember when I went over, when we got married was my first time to go over to Northern Ireland. And if you could describe a little bit more about walls. I think in America we sometimes think about walls differently uh, than the experience in Northern Ireland. So if can you describe a little bit about the conflict
Yeah.
and what brought the walls into being, like their actual physical, literal walls at
Yeah.
the time?
No, I think that's important. And it is like what's really interesting, Melody, too, is there's still two stories to what happened, almost like we haven't an agreed narrative of what happened. But the modern troubles that what we're kind of talking about over the last 40 years and probably arose like after the civil rights movement in America and across the world, where men and women were like fighting for equality and other rights. It came to Ireland, and in Northern Ireland, Catholics didn't they weren't given like jobs, housing. They weren't. It was only one person in the house was allowed to vote. So how policies were given out by local government meant that the Catholic community was very much marginalized, oppressed, and forgotten about. And an incident happened where Catholics were burnt out of their home in West Belfast and Bombay Street in around 1968, and it caused chaos. And the British government had sent in the British Army to kind of help the Catholic community. And the Catholic community at that time were celebrating and giving thanks for, like, people are looking at finally listening and looking after them. And but what happened then was around a sectarian conflict like emerged like into the historical story. And me and Steve used to teach people about conflict resolution, but what happened was the government decided to build 40-foot walls dividing Catholics and Protestants. And where they couldn't build walls, they built like freeways or industrial estates that separated communities. So we're talking, we do think about things like the Berlin Wall, and other, like, maybe walls that separate us, well, big, huge fences, but whatever. But these walls haven't come down even to this day. And in Belfast alone, there's 26 miles of walls, fences, like freeways, industrial estates that are separating, Catholic and Protestant communities from each other. And like that the physicality of it's horrible, but the reality is 93% of our education system segregated. Our housing system, like 80% of our communities are still segregated living, where Catholics live on one side, Protestants live on the other. We have limited mixed kind of arrangements of living together, and we're still sadly we're still a really deeply divided community. But the biggest walls for us is the walls in our minds. So there's a real challenge for people getting over the end walls. Like, they're now driving through streets where the walls, you can bypass the walls now. There's gates that have been opened. They're a tourist attraction, but the walls in the mind are still massive. Like, if for even for kids today, like, 20-year-olds are maybe meeting a girlfriend, and a parent might hear they're from the Protestant community or from the Catholic community, and they'll be uncomfortable with that. And so the walls in the mind, that polarization still exists, and it's a massive thing. And it, in a way, it breaks my heart. But when me and Steve first met, it was love at first sight. But
I understand. I totally get that, Joe. I do understand that. But what was it like when you first met?
I think
how did you meet?
I think, well, St. Francis of Assisi had a prayer and a quote about seek first to understand before you're understood. And me and Steve, we get into youth ministry, youth work through our volunteering in local church, and an organization where I'm the CEO of an interchurch charity called YouthLink. But at that time, 25 years ago, me and Steve were young people, and we had hair and dashing good looks and all that. And we just met each other. But right away, there's an inbuilt mechanism within people to spot those that are different. It's hard to explain, but by how people speak, how people dress, how people hold themselves, like what background they're from. And I judged Steve right away and said, he's definitely a Protestant unionist British guy. And I don't know if I like him, but I gradually worked on him. I don't know, Steve, you come in now.
Really? You didn't know? You were like, clearly an other.
Yeah,
Clearly
definitely.
not
Like within Northern Ireland, we say about, you can tell someone by, how they say the letter H or the letter A or A, and what school they go to, or what colors they're wearing, football team they support. You can tell in 5 seconds probably where or what someone's identity is, and it's a skill.
So you're kind of taught to listen to to sussing out, as you would say, but to sort of figuring out like, oh, well, he's a Liverpool fan. He's
Yeah. Yeah, there's a bit of I think it's like a security mechanism or a safety mechanism where you want to be with those that are familiar to you, that people like you.
I think that's the big key to it, really, Joe, is that we're taught that there is safety within the structure of the familiarity. We're taught that when you're around people who believe the same things as you, who acknowledge the same things as you, who do the same things as you, then that's where there's safety for you. And so for us, that's why within Northern Ireland, we're very good at labeling, very good at stereotyping. And so by labeling and stereotyping people, we can make an immediate determination of if this is a safe area for us, if this is a safe person for us to be with, and if there's comfort within that. And I think as we talk about meeting each other for the first time, that was something that we both, whether we realized it or not, that was something we both had to overcome, was actually stepping out of the familiar and stepping out of the comfort zones as well. We had to be open to that idea of wanting to learn beyond the safety of where we resided, and we had to be open to the concept of learning about that which we were taught to fear. I think that's the society, just even in general, that we live in at the minute, in terms of polarization, is, we're taught that change is different. We're taught that people who are different are to be feared. And for me at least, that was what I wanted to do, was to move beyond. There's the Norwegian sociologist who's kind of the modern day founding father of peace and conflict studies, Johan Galtung, and he has this great triangle. He's lots of triangles. He loved his triangles, but he has this great triangle that he talks about the attitudes and the behaviors and the contradictions. And so within any conflict or with any difference or disagreement, there's contradictions, but they're often fueled by people's behaviors and people's attitudes. And so when you're within the safety and structure of your own communities, surrounded by people who think the same things, then often those attitudes always look the same, and those behaviors always look the same, and those contradictions always look the same. And so being able to get to a spot where you actually wanted to challenge your own attitudes and think about your own behavior and try to understand those contradictions, because the contradiction was, growing up as a Protestant, that perhaps I was to be fearful of Catholics or people in the Catholic community. And then because of that contradiction, then that also that directed my behaviors. And then that also helped form and mold my attitudes. And so by challenging some of those contradictions, or maybe just understanding some of those contradictions better, then I could better have more control of my behaviors, of my attitudes, and work towards then not only changing those, but also changing myself initially.
Yeah. And I think there's something about like that, like the narrative around you. For me, like growing up, like the British were the bad guys, security forces were the bad guys, and there was no questioning that narrative. Like we were the good guys. My team were the good guys, and with that comes like violence, which was sectarian terrorist attacks where children were blown up. You kind of, in some ways, you turned a blind eye to that because it was against the bad guys, it was against the enemy. But with hindsight, you realize actually you're caught up in something that actually is evil, or there's not a truth to it. And actually there's a show on Disney at the minute called Say Nothing that it's really worth watching, about the people that were disappeared during our conflict. And it shows the ugly side of people from my community, and the brokenness of conflict, and how normal people do terrible things. But for me, the narrative was quite clear that anyone that had an English accent, that was British, or involved in the security forces, was the enemy and to be feared. And like when I first met Steve, it was the first time, I'm in a room with something that kind of encapsulates, or kind of is linked to this other that I'm meant to be afraid of. And the space is important too, because me and Steve were in a safe space. And like even what you started this evening talking, Melody, about them spiritual disciplines, but there's something about that, that sacred space, that sort of space of shalom and oneness that me and Steve had experienced in our first encounter, where we knew, okay, we've got our own story, our own stuff, but the Spirit of God's at work. There's holy ground, and it's trying to like wrestle in with our demons of the past, and see what attitudes need challenged, what histories need like challenged, how we listen to the other with both of our ears. So yeah, that was really important for me, that we were in a safe space, because for me there was a lot of crying and being upset, and like that journey of reconciliation with God and with Steve and others was massive for me.
So what was that what does that journey look like? And I guess a couple of thoughts that I have here is one that I just want to clarify that our basic premise is that society as a whole, everywhere around the world right now, is very divided. And we have othered others. And we, because of AI and because of social media and because like we only have voices that agree with us. So then we're surprised when we learn that there are other people who think differently, but we don't know how to talk to them. Like we don't know how to engage. I almost put it in my sermon this week, but then I cut it out about Ted Lasso's, be curious, not judgmental. Like how do we move from that space of fear and hatred, of wrath of the other, to a space where we can be curious and not judgmental?
Yeah. There's a great professor called John Paul Lederich, probably butchered that. But he is I think he's at Notre Dame. But he writes a lot. He's done some really pioneering work on conflict transformation. And he wrote a particular article back in, I think it was 2005, and it was called The Moral Imagination. And he describes this moral imagination as the capacity to recognize turning points and possibilities in order to venture down unknown paths and create what does not yet exist. And so it's that challenge in reference to peace building, which is actually another one of Galton's triangles. He talks about peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. And so we have to recognize as part of our peace work where we fall into. Are we just trying to keep peace? Are we just trying to stop conflict from happening? Are we trying to help make peace, or are we actually trying to build peace? Are we involved in the building of that? But as we think about this moral imagination, it's really that capacity to imagine and generate those constructive processes that are rooted in the day-to-day challenges of difference and disagreement and destructiveness and fear. And so until we ultimately have a desire to want to venture down those unknown paths, that's really how we first work toward that in terms of the otherisms. Is we have to have an acceptance that there is actually a path where we can go and learn about others, where we can go embrace others, and maybe it's a long path, and maybe it's not a just instant switch where suddenly we're called to love our neighbor, and it's like, well, we'll just go love our neighbor, whatever that looks like. Maybe there is a little bit of fearfulness still as we journey on this path, but recognizing that where we are and the differences we have and the otherisms that we have, we call it a lens that we see others with, and often our lens is based on what was, based on our own experiences. So the lens with which I viewed Catholics growing up was based on everything that had happened to me to that point. And so part of our challenge in looking forward and envisioning forward for a shared experience is thinking about how do we change our lens as to how we view people. How do we view people not through the perception of what has happened, but now through an idea of what could be, and then slowly work toward a journey together. And maybe that journey together first begins with understanding ourselves a little more and what fuels our fear and our reluctance or our desire to, make somebody, label them with the idea of other.
I think
Yeah.
that's really helpful. And one of the things that I think what might be important to share here is that both of you had known violence in your families. And so when you first were becoming friends, you did have I don't want to say a rightful fear, but you had experienced the hatred. like you had experienced in physical ways, the violence. And so one of the things that's sort of in uh, one of the things that I think really saying, you know, how do you move past that fear? You know, like how do I lessen that? Because that's really what draws us back into not wanting to make that turn, not wanting to say, you know, like I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to live with bitterness. I don't want to live with wrath. So how can we say, you know, I'm open to this now. I don't want to live this way, but I still have this fear inside of me. I don't feel safe.
Yeah, I think even just that word safe, like I think part of the reason why we haven't moved on completely in Northern Ireland is because there's people still don't feel safe. They feel if the walls come down, they'll have to deal with some of their junk from the past, some of their feelings of hatred or uncomfortableness, and that's a challenge. But for me, like you're right, Mel, like the violence that me and Steve have experienced, our families, you know, it's been around even as a young child. I know you've got some young listeners here, maybe Francis might be listening, but as a young child, like the army would drive down the streets and shout like derogatory words or bad words at kids. And as kids, we were throwing stones at army jeeps as they're going by. So that's violent. And as a child, you should be kicking a football. You should be playing. And then in my teens, my best friend's dad was shot dead by terrorists from the Protestant community, and that really struck me. But I heard almost a family secret that my grandfather, just before I was born, was shot dead as he was opening his sweet shop. He had a corner shop, and the British Army sniper shot him once in the head for being a Catholic, and that incident shaped my whole family. You know, my dad's family are still traumatized and impacted. The mental health, the ripple effect of violence is horrific. Like what it does to communities, it's horrific. And for me as a teenager, that ripped me apart and led me into many bad choices and dark places, and really politically like hating stronger, like that, hating the other. And I suppose that was a journey of darkness for me, and towards like my late teens, about 20, I came into a relationship with God, and I had a real sense of God saying to me, like, you need to love my people, you need to forgive, you need to like to work on reconciliation. And I felt that challenge was very much directed, go to the other. You know, we think it Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well, which is like every cultural norm is broken. Don't hang out with Samaritans. Don't meet women on your own, and don't talk to them, especially if they've got five husbands. And for me, I felt a real sense of God saying, you need to be with, if you want to know me, you need to meet the people that I created. You need to meet the other. And that for me in life, I have random conversations in bus stops or trains with people that are different to hear, where are you from? What do you do? And but when me and Steve met, I did feel a yearning to reach out and be forgiven, and but also to say sorry for what my people had done to Steve's people and the community, but also to be reconciled. And it meant taking a risk. It meant talking about the trauma from my past, things that are uncomfortable, like violence that like we've experienced around us, and but being in a room to listen and hear, you know, hear what Steve experienced as a young person was his dad's job, but also the sectarianism that other people experience, like putting, you know, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes or the other lens that Steve talked about. There's something really powerful just trying to, you know, that old proverb, you know, you don't know a man until you've walked in his shoes. But there's something in it until you like eat food with someone, break bread with them, hear their story. Like so for me, because of the pain of the violence and being exposed to people dying or bombs going off or the sectarianism in the background, it has impacted me to this day, and it hasn't gone away. And I still watch television shows, and I get lumps in my throat. I watch things that are happening in Israel, Palestine, and see like that Palestinian kid. That was me when I was a kid. I didn't know what was going on, but I was throwing stones. And you've got stuff related to our story that still plays itself out today, and you're trying to heal that junk. And one way to do it is to meet people not like you, to meet those that are different, and actually being open to learn and realizing that you're a lot more like the people that are different than you think.
So maybe let's talk about today, because let's talk about more recent events, like not necessarily the headlines, but just in a world where it is becoming so easy to only have meaningful conversations with people that are what Elizabeth Oldfield says is PLM, people like me, and we sort of surround ourselves with people like me. What, I guess, for some of us who may be on the edge of despair, do each of you have hope for today and the future? Is there any hope for us? And if there is hope for us, what can we do to move us towards peace building instead of remaining in polarization and wrath? So do you have hope? And if you have hope, what can we do to be a part of it?
For me, as we think about that idea of peace building, Liederich goes back and talks about 4 disciplines, which each of which requires a little bit of imagination. But for me, it's what gives me hope. And he says that the essence of peace building is found in these 4 disciplines, and the first one is the centrality of relationships. And so for me, that's something that gives me hope, is that I value the relationships that I have. I value the people that I know. I value the ability to envision a wider set of relationships. And then what gives me hope is that I have the power and the personal responsibility for my own choices and behavior within those relationships. And so understanding that interconnectedness and that mutuality, I think, is something that does give me hope. The other 3 disciplines within that he touches on are the practice of paradoxical curiosity. So, if violence or if conflict is driven by polarization, if, by polarizing we get to the isms and the others not like me, then we have the choice about how to respond in these situations that might also seem so hopeless. So we not only have the value of the relationships and the centrality of those relationships, but we have our choice as to how we can respond within this. How do we, what does our capacity look like to rise above the divisions and to reach beyond the accepted meanings, and to push back against the fear? How do we respect the complexity of everything around us, but how do we seek something beyond that which is visible as well? Because I think ultimately that's what hope is. Envisaging beyond just that which we see, and then how do we embrace creativity? So the final 2 disciplines that he touches on are the space for creativity, and then the willingness to risk. And so, as we think about those things, what does it look like? So the idea of creativity is really something that arises out of the everyday. How do we live in a way that moves, that is something new, that moves beyond just what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to act? How do we live out the hope that we find, in particular as part of our faith? And then how do we take a risk? How do we step out into that unknown without any guarantee of success or safety. The first time Jill and I met, and as we undertook our own journey of transformation, we could have it could have dramatically failed as well. We could have started to hear each other's stories, and we could have pushed back against that, and we could have gone back to the safety and security of everything that brought us to that point. But we both embraced that risk, and we wanted to explore together what that looked like beyond just where we are right now. And because at the end of the day, I think that peace is a mystery. Like, whatever our peace building looks like, whatever our hope looks like, we're moving toward or into a new, mysterious, unexpected future. It's a difficult journey, because if it was easy, then we'd all be at peace, and there wouldn't be conflict, and there wouldn't be division, and there wouldn't be segregation or polarization or anything else. And so, I think we have to have that risk, and we have to have a willingness to begin that journey to live out what being a peace builder and what being a peacemaker and what being a peacekeeper then is as part of all of that.
Yeah, for me, I think it's a good question, Melody, and these times. I think COVID has amplified fear in people's lives and alienation, and it's changed the world forever, I think. And we now live in a world that is fueled by polarization. It sells newspapers. It makes oil more expensive. It creates tariffs. It does all that. But within it all, I think what causes polarization, I think for me, is people feel that they don't matter, that they don't belong, or they don't realize that maybe they are, they're created in God's image and likeness. They just don't feel they matter. And when they attach themselves to an idea that's polarized, they feel part of something, and it lets them live out their identity or some of their brokenness. And like I really have loved kind of, I know I'm on an American podcast, but listening, like I think in Europe we can easily go, oh, there's the Trump voters, the Republicans, Democrats, and without realizing the complexity, like we can't look into that situation. And I love listening to people that are on both sides of them polar divides. And when you listen, again, like me and Steve, people are so similar. And at the heart of the matter is that they want to have their voice heard. They want to feel like they belong, or they have something to say. And the world around them has not given them that voice to say anything. And I know some of your listeners are here. You might have someone that's 5, you might have someone at 90, but we need the 90-year-olds to tell their story, because we hope that we can learn something from them, and we hope that the next generation doesn't disregard the elderly, those that have experienced things. And we also hope as well, for me, like young people see the world different than we do, and there's something else to offer. And the polarization that we're currently experiencing has happened in the world over centuries. That cyclical nature of humanity, like these things happen, and we learn that as humans we're a bit dumb, and we get slightly better at it. And somewhere down the line, we have someone like coming to bring us together and say, look, how do we do this better? And it helps. But for me, like my hope is that people become more aware and more curious, a bit like Ted Lasso, on that something inside, like that voice inside that's either going, they're different, like, what should I do about it? My phone, I judge my I suppose my credibility around diversity or relationships and cross-community work, peace building on my mobile phone. And I often ask people here, how many people have you got on your phone that are a different skin color, who are a different gender, a different sexuality, a different social class, a different, religion. And I do get curious about difference. And I'm probably, there's part of me, it's almost like my kids, like, say, Dad, why, like, leave that like on the holidays, I was asking someone, on a bus, where are you from? Because they were a different skin color to me, and I wanted to know where they're from. What about the language they speak? I just wanted to know everything about them because they were so different from me, and I love that because it helps me to get over my own xenophobia, racism, sectarianism, homophobia, disabled phobia, and there's an acknowledgement within me that, you know, I am not. I'm just one person. Like I'm only one individual in the fabric of society, and I'm not complete without the people around me. And my life has been enhanced by Steve and the other, and even knowing Steve, like Melody. I remember when me and Steve were in Detroit, and I was like, Steve, that girl, that minister in that church, I think you like her. I know the way you're acting around her. You like her. Oh, no, 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 we're just friends, Joe. We're just friends. I'm like, yeah, right. I
Yeah, you
like
could
where
have
I
shared
grew
that with
up
me
where
as
that
well, by the
where I
way.
grew up, Steve, that's not friends. The way you're looking at her, you like her. And he's like, no, 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 no. But getting to know each other and realizing, we're friends. Like I never had, I have a friend, Manaf, who was my first Muslim friend, and sitting down and chatting with him and hearing his story, his family, and how he prays, like it was like eye-opening for me to think about that. Like that was the unknown to me, and learning how he does family, he does God, and like that's another aspect was monumental to me. Getting to know people with disabilities and hearing their story, it changes me because I realize, I realize my own brokenness and my own kind of, how much I need to learn about others. And my hope is that people realize that they aren't right. They don't have the truth. And me and Steve grew up thinking that our side's right, or that our narrative, the people like us are the right ones. I hope that people realize that the world is made up of many languages, many nationalities, many different ways of thinking, and it's beautiful because of it. If the world was all the same, if we were all people like me, it would be boring as hell. And I just hope that we continue to appreciate the beauty of creation in each other.
When I think just to add on to that, Joe, the other part is it also requires a commitment. It requires a continual daily commitment as well to embrace that idea, to see the face of God in the other, to feel the world from their perspective, to place ourselves not in control of, but on a journey alongside. And so like I think that's the challenge for all of us in a world where we often so crave hope is that idea that we have to continually commit through our faith to that idea of reconciliation, of transforming the difference, of transforming the culture, of transforming the society and the world around us. Because if we don't commit to it, then we learn the lessons and it brings us to this point. But the idea of peace building is that we're on this journey, and it's a continual journey, and it continues every single day. And so we have to be disciplined, and we have to commit to that reaching out every single day. And
Yeah.
it requires, it's difficult, and it requires our energy, and it requires our diligence, and it requires ourself to catch the old attitudes and the old behaviors and the old contradictions that we're falling back into as well. We have to continue to move forward then as part of that.
Yeah, it keeps us real. Like I mean, one of the things I've been really, I know we've started this maybe talking about the conflict, and conflict. Not everyone's experienced that society that we grew up on, but the idea of polarization to peace for me works in other ways. Like at the minute, I'm thinking like in my phone that I talk about all the diversity. I don't have enough people that I know. There's not enough people I know that are really on the breadline. I grew up, my mom and dad I grew up in poverty, but this moment in time, I don't have enough friends that actually are struggling. And so I'm missing that struggle in my life. I'm missing knowing the pain that they're going through. I'm probably missing not enough like older, elderly people in my life. So I'm missing kind of that wisdom. But like making the commitment to try and encounter, and maybe I'm doing it for selfish reasons because I realize that kind of deficit in my life where I don't have enough people um, that are poor. And the reason why I'm being selfish is because for me, as a Christian, I encounter God um, in probably often in the people that are forgotten about it, in that other that maybe like the poor that people kind of forget about. And also I do think even probably one in modern day Christianity, and we know our churches are kind of missing the suffering in others. I do think I try to, and maybe I'm verging off in different territory, but that idea of polarizations to peace, like people that are struggling want someone to reach out and say, "How are you?" Like, and I think we sometimes feel afraid to talk about our own suffering, and it links into peace process and reconciliation, where we need to tell our story. We need to talk about hurt, pain, anxiety, because once we do, that brings us to peace. We need that space to not be marginalized or polarized, to have someone to listen and to draw us into that, like that shalom, that oneness, that peace of God. And it's difficult. So I constantly, Melody, just feel incomplete because I probably, if I'm spending too much time like people like me, I need to go and spend more time with people not like me. Um and the danger of that is I become someone that's pointing the finger at people at me, going, why don't you be like them? And I feel like I get the higher ground, but I do I do feel that it takes commitment, it takes challenge, and if only we realize the blessing and the gift in being with people not like us. And a bit Steve was talking about research and all, and I was reading this article the other day about if you speak more than one language, you're less likely to be homophobic, sectarian, racist, xenophobic, a disableist, ableist. But speaking that second language is about you're open to the other. You're open to kind of hearing a different language and speaking a different language. And there's a fear with us and even to try. Like if we hear someone speaking a different language, we're like, oh, I wonder what they're saying. They're talking about us. But I think we need to challenge ourselves and be committed to there's another way. There's not just the one path.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for spending time and sharing part of your story. And just want to sort of conclude with this story that I ended my sermon on Sunday with it, but I don't think it made the live stream. So a few weeks ago, I was sharing with a woman in our congregation about John 13, where Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and it's the night before his arrest. So he's with the one who would betray him. He's knowing, how much he knew, we don't really know, but he knows that something is about to happen, and he's trying to tell it to the disciples and all, the one who would deny him. And he says, love one another. And even in the midst of knowing all of that pain and all of that uncertainty and all of that fear that they're about to go through together, he says, love one another. And when I was done talking about this wonderful woman in our congregation came forward and she said, that just made me so happy because when I was a little girl and I would fight with my brother, my mom would just shout, love one another. And, again, Elizabeth Oldfield in the book, she talks about, how can we reset and restart, when we're sitting with somebody on the bus, when we're sitting with somebody that we're really, really struggling with. And, how can we have that curious but not judgmental attitude of saying, oh, I'm open to hearing and I want to understand. Because even if we're speaking the same language, it might be different words and it overcomes it. Thank you so much. All that to say, thank you so much for sharing your story and for being open with us here at the Sunrise Road podcast. I love and appreciate that you're both still working in peace and reconciliation with young people. Joe, your work at YouthLink I know is so important, and as someone who knew you way back, I'm proud of what you've done, and becoming the CEO. You're doing such great work, and Stevie's my always and forever, and just so proud of what he's doing at Wesleyan and continuing to find platforms to talk about this. So love you both. Thanks for letting me call in this favor. And we'll see you all next week on the Sunrise Road.